Hello and welcome. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that that this talk is going to be recorded. If you're not speaking at the moment, please do turn off your microphone. Feel free to turn off your cameras unless you don't mind appearing in the recording. I also want to start by stating that we're gathered here, some of us on physically and all of us using resources extracted from the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, caretakers of this land since time immemorial. And I hope that in addition to acknowledging this fact and how we benefit from this ongoing colonial displacement, this series of speakers and workshops will help move us towards concrete actions for reconciliation by learning about and exploring how power and privilege are implicated in our professional values and in our practices. Given my own positionality as a cisgendered man, as a person of East Asian heritage, who's often treated as white, as a disabled person, but also a person with the privilege of relative employment security, given my positionality, I try to understand my own work as contributing to a social good. But if that work didn't include or address those who are pushed to the margins of our society, then who is it really working for? I don't want to be the intellectual wing of settler colonialism, white supremacy, or heteropatriarchy. And I hope that this series of lectures and workshops will help us to imagine ourselves outside of that as well. In particular, I hope this series of speakers and workshops and this lecture in particular can help us become more reflexive about our relationship with fellow researchers and with everyone with whom we share this society. And I want to thank not only the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo, but also joining us remotely, the Concordia Tag Lab, the University of Alberta Digital Humanities folks, and the University of Wisconsin Serious Play Group for being a part of this efforts and being a part of this project. Today, I'm pleased to introduce a distinguished speaker, Dr. André Brock. Andre's talk is entitled The Changing Same, Blackness and Representation in Video Games. And Dr. Brock is an associate professor at Georgia State University. He's published on racial representation in video games, critical informatics and approaches to data analysis, and Black technocultures on Twitter and elsewhere in new media. Notably, his 2021 monograph published by NYU Press, Distributed Blackness, has won book awards from the Popular Culture Association of the United States and the Association of Internet Researchers. Reviews have alternatively described it as powerful, richly theoretical and interdisciplinary, awe-inspiring, ambitious, and undoubtedly necessary. And I will add that it is not only an extraordinarily profound study of Black technoculture that looks at how Black users of Twitter can simultaneously engage in politics and express joy within structures organized by white supremacy, it also provides one of the clearest and most extensive explanations of critical technological discourse analysis, or CTDA, his versatile and incisive method for understanding the culturally situated uptake and enactment of technological practices. The method is a boon to critical researchers, game scholars, design practitioners, and UX researchers alike. And we are lucky to hear from him today. Let's all virtually welcome Dr. André Brock. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous, extraordinarily generous introduction. I have not read all those reviews, so I appreciate hearing about them. So good afternoon. Before I continue, I'd like to thank Dr. Gerald Voorhees and his staff here at the Games Institute for inviting me to give this talk. So I don't like to fly long distances, so I can't be there with you in person, but hopefully this presentation will do a little bit to satisfy you. So today's work is a very, very early work in progress. As I'm trying to return to the video game studies that I've neglected for so long. I originally started looking at video games in earnest with a 2009 article on Resident Evil 5, which talks about race representation in gaming. And I'm really proud of that article. In many ways, I think it set the tone for later efforts such as Communication So White and Gaming So White that have happened in recent years. And I'm really proud of it because it provided a critical approach to understanding how both game interfaces, game mechanics, and game audiences work together to constitute racial identities that our people are experiencing and enacting on screen. And I hope that this work continues in this tradition. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I'm interested in how racial identity, specifically Blackness, gets enacted in digital spaces. In distributed Blackness, I argue that Blackness can be understood as an informational identity, one that's expressed through semiotic and material relationships between content, hardware, code, performances, and cultural phenomena. And by this, I mean that digital identity, even in our current multi-mediated TikTok era, is still largely a textual enactment of self. Unlike our physical selves, which are limited to one material space at a time, online identities can exist in multiple places at once, although not always in the same context or enactment. And I keep using the word enactment because I prefer it to performance. When I first started doing this work in the early 2000s, uh, the most abundant body of research on race online was digital divide research. And it argued that there were few minorities to be found online because it held what I call a deficit model, where minorities were understood to lack either material access, they didn't have a computer, economic access, they couldn't afford the subscription, technical literacy, they didn't know how to use a computer, or connection, they didn't have broadband, right? That was a later innovation, right? And that particular framing really bothered me, in part because I grew up in, even as grew up in the South, but when I lived in New York, I constantly saw people around me using the latest telecommunications devices, whether it was drug dealers and two-way pagers, or random people having Blackberries, or even cell phone usage. I never ever felt like Black people were being left behind. In fact, we were using the devices as they fit into our daily lives, right? Also, it's kind of hard to carry a desktop computer around with you on the subway. Right? And so, in order to kind of contest this particular framing of Black and minority digital practice, I took to my own arguments to say that, in large part, Black digital practice is goes above and beyond the Western paradigm of productivity and efficiency. We tend to use things that augment our lives in particular ways, and from that perspective, we can understand that there is actually a Black digital expertise. Right. And so I started talking about racial identities then, and I constantly got asked, well, how do you know they're actually Black? And I used to use Chris Rock's definition of what Blackness is, although it doesn't hold up very well, and I never repeat the joke properly. But there's a bit in one of his early comedy specials where he talks about how the place he's performing has a white busboy with a prosthetic leg. And he's like, this poor man who barely makes any money and is disabled would rather maintain and keep his whiteness than be a rich Black man like me. Right. So there, I think Rock makes a really compelling argument that to be Black is to not just enjoy the capacity to dance well or to play badly like some NBA basketball players in Atlanta or other characteristics associated with Blackness. It's also to accept that being Black comes with a large set of uh, impairments, and obstacles that keep you from being your fullest self. And the digital does a lot to try to reduce that. If you're familiar with Frantz Fanon, where he talks about being hailed as a Black man in his native island in the Caribbean, he says that as he was walking down the street, he encountered a young woman shopping with her son, both white. And as he walked down the street, the son turned to his mother with horror and said, "Look, Mama, a Negro." And Fanon calls this a phenomenological return. He said in that moment, he was returned and reduced to his body, right? And he argues that in some ways that is a pathological um, association with being part of the Western civilization project. and that he can only be a Black man. At the time, he was studying to become a doctor. He had published a couple of books, so he was relatively accomplished and what we would call a white collar professional today. But that cry of horror and recognition from that young white child reduced him to simply his body. And so I argue in Distributed Blackness that online does something to um, relinquish, to diminish that phenomenological return. Borrowing a quote from the philosopher Lewis Gordon, I argue that in online spaces, I'm not only a point of view, but I am a point that is to be viewed. Right. And so if you think about it in the multiple spaces that you occupy as a social media user, whatever your racial identity may be, parts, bits and pieces of you are present in each space you occupy, whether that's LinkedIn, whether that's your group chat, whether that's Twitter, which is where I live, right? Or other spaces, parts of you are inhabiting each of those spaces. So you can distribute your informational body across multiple spaces, which is one of the benefits of the digital, right? Even more, once you do that digital practice of publishing yourself to whatever online space you prefer, your self becomes available as an archive, mostly for the access by the platform, but we can talk about that later in the Q&A, but also for yourself. And it becomes available as an archive for retrieval, for discernment, and sometimes even for debate, right? Overall, I argue that people use technologies to reproduce themselves in whatever configuration the technology allows. Oops, let me not move my slide too fast. And as those of us gamers who obsess over character creation know, right? Apparently, it's not Diablo 4, Path of Exile or Black Desert have some of the best character creators around, right? We must publish the person we are in these spaces, which is odd, right? Because I've run into any number of um, non-Black gamers who are much more interested in becoming purple or elves or anything else. Well, instead, I usually try to recreate myself as faithfully as possible, given whatever the technology offers, right? But I would argue even in your imaginary posturings, when you play with the character creator, you're still creating an image of yourself. And so we publish ourselves online or the digital, right? And a lot of that is intentional, unless you walk by a Ring camera, right? Because doing so means that the digital technologies we use shape us and are shaped by us, if that makes sense. This definition of online identity largely applies to our social network infrastructure, right? Because I'm a humanist, I tend to lean towards sociology, particularly Irving Goffman's work on the dramaturgical self, where he argues that the self is actually a series of performances in a particular context with particular appearances and particular mannerisms. And in particular, Goffman focuses on micro interactions between people, right, as a way to determine how, as a way that appearance determines the role that you're going to play for the audience in front of you, given the context around you, right? And he says in these micro interactions, people give off two signals, one that they give intentionally, right, and one that they give off. And if you think about any social media profile, the signs given are usually the content they post, words, sounds, images, or videos, right? The signs given off are less in your face, but they're still visible and they help to contextualize the content that each individual user posts. So profile pictures, which are displayed at the front of every post, regardless pretty much of whatever social media site you use, that will have a tiny either circle or square thumbnail with your picture, that so that people have an additional layer of information to know who's posting what. So just profile pictures, display names, banner images, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. I remember when we didn't have them, but also friend and follower list or Spotify playlist, right? Twitter also shows, if you go to anybody's profile, that all the things that they've liked, which has gotten me in trouble. But again, that's another piece of the conversation to be held later on. Another way to just understand signs and signs given off can be found in our use of modern GPS apps, right? If you think about it, once you enter your destination and hit start, the application signifies or makes you appear on the representation of the street that you're on and the destination that you're going to. It either uses a little arrow or a little car if you use Waze, right? Meanwhile, there are signs being given off about you as you navigate from your origin to your destination. Data about your speed, your phone, the application you're using, the network you're on, your operating system, and even every Wi-Fi network is a sign given off during your performance or enactment of self as a traveler using a GPS app. And I think this is actually really important to understand as a gamer, right? In part because gaming identity is still an interestingly gendered and fraught category, right? And so I often ask my students, which one of them are gamers? And if you can imagine yourself in this undergraduate classroom or even graduate students, right? If I say, which one of you is a gamer? I would argue most of the men and a few women will raise their hands. Most of the women, however, will not raise their hands. And that's because the sign that many people associate with gaming is the use of either the PC, shout out to the PC Master Race, which I just joined, right? Or a console, right? And those are relatively sophisticated gaming systems, which require a lot of technical know-how or a lot of money, right? And so gaming as a sign is gendered, it's economic, right? And in many ways, it requires the acquisition of specific equipment and literacies in order to understand. But then I expand the definition of gaming and I ask the women who didn't raise their hands, well, hey, how many of you play The Sims? Hands go up. How many of you play Stardew Village? Right? Hands go up. Right? And it turns out that people can understand themselves as gamers if you point out that many of the activities they do for leisure in these applications that are held on our phone, or for many of us who have a Switch, right, are also part of what a gaming identity can be, even though we tend to restrict it or reduce it to the particular arcane practices that we associate with gaming, right? And so this has become really important to me because if you don't identify yourself as a gamer, or if you do identify yourself as a gamer, what signs do you look for in the media that you love to interact with the most? I mentioned a few slides ago that one of the signs that you give off, or at least in your social media life, is sound. Sometimes that's your Spotify playlist, sometimes that's the audio to your video, but also think about it in terms of the recent rise of voice chat apps such as Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces or whatever Facebook called it, right? Many of which are centered around virtual settings where people talk at and over one another over and over again. And thanks to podcast and video, podcast, video, and these chat spaces, we're more aware of sound in online spaces than ever before. In gaming, sound has become more important than ever as the developers use high fidelity audio engines to provide immersion, right, through surround sound, where audio provides environmental and interactive cues. But sound has a narrative and cultural capacity as well. Researchers have long been interested in understanding whether listeners can determine another person's race just by hearing them talk. And these studies have largely been used in linguistics, sociology, social work, and other spaces, often to determine whether discrimination is happening, right? Whether employers, landlords, or other authorities will discriminate against people they talk to over the phone, right, based upon their perception of their racialized audio identity or their voice, right? And it turns out, in particular, because Americans are overstudied and overgeneralized as a research population, that Americans are really good at determining if a caller is a Black man or Black woman, right? And many of these researchers have found that being able to determine whether a person occupies a particular racial identity has attendant possibilities for racial discrimination. And I know this happens in Canada too, but we're just going to talk about Americans. Right? This becomes interesting in voice, though, because gamers know this already. How many folk on the call or in the Zoom use voice chat while playing multiplayer with randoms? Don't raise your hand because I can't see you. But I know that some of you have thought about it, many of you do, and the like, right? And so Kishana Gray found that many of the Black and queer women gamers that she studied actually turn voice chat off or use mods to alter the pitch of their voice, because it turns out that men can be really nasty or sexual or both towards minorities in multiplayer games. She contends, and I agree, that many male gamers believe that gaming is a masculine activity. And I've gone so far in my work to argue that the default digital identity of which video games is a part is white, male, masculine, heterosexual, or in some cases hypersexual, and middle class. Right. But today I want to ask a little bit more, like, in what other ways can we see this particular archetype work in video games? Video games have long had a whiteness, I'm gonna call it a problem, right? The vast majority of video game protagonists over the last three console generations have been grizzled, nondescript, genocidal kleptomaniacs. I mean, white males, right? And I call them genocidal kleptomaniacs in part because I'm thinking of one of the games I'll talk about in a few minutes, which is Uncharted, featuring Nathan Drake. And Nathan seems to be an everyman, right? Which is why I say he's nondescript. You basically wouldn't recognize him if you pass him on the street because he looks like everybody else, right? But Nathan has an extraordinary capacity to kill waves upon waves of antagonists. He's an expert shot. He also knows a little karate, and he just, in order to pursue his goal of robbing temples and romancing his romantic interest, right? He kills hundreds of people to the point where by the third game they were even calling out why he was doing this thing and as part of the game's narrative and progression, right? I've gone on record as saying in my 2009 article on Resident Evil that Asian video games also afford Western audiences the capacity to read whiteness onto the characters there, in part because of the Western occupation of Japan and the attendant post-World War II domination of media by Hollywood and the like. And so I definitely am interested in fleshing this out further if you guys want to talk about it. Um, but even before Japanese and later Chinese and Korean companies began catering to a Western gaming market, the characters that they put on screen, whether it's anime or video games themselves, were easily able to be read by Western gamers as white. Right? There are similar stereotypes around race and identity for women protagonists as well, except they're worse, right? The women, I'm particularly thinking of a design studio called Vanillaware, are often portrayed with hypersexualized bodies. Developers have gone on record as bragging that their games have the best breast physics in the industry. I'm thinking of beach volleyball. I can't remember the name of it, but I'm sure you guys might, right? So they're hypersexualized. If they're in games that require combat, they often wear chainmail bikinis or super short skirts to show off as much of their leg and buttocks as possible. Um, and when it comes to actually playing them, if you can play them, they have lesser attributes than the men, right? They may be more agile, but they're never as strong. They're not necessarily portrayed as more intelligent, right? Or wise. They're just listed as their characteristics are not as high as the male characters you may play. Another possibility, another archetype for women in games is the concept of fridging, Fridging, and I'll explain it just because I can't see your reactions to when I said the word, right? The idea that the motivation for the male protagonist in many aspects of Western media is that a woman has to die in order to set him off on his pathway of redemption, of vengeance, or whatever, right? The only recent exception I would argue is John Wick, right, where his dog is killed, right, because his wife dies of natural causes, right? And so John Wick, if you think about it, is the most aggrieved dog owner in the entire universe. He's had 4 movies now where he just kills dozens of people simply because somebody killed his dog. Sorry, couldn't help it. Right? And so in the Resident Evil article that I wrote, I talked a little bit about these really limited possibilities for women in games, focusing on a character in that game known as Shiva Alomar. And Shiva was one of the first problematic women characters that I actually paid attention to, in part because Resident Evil 5 was a co-op game. She had to survive in order for you to advance in the game, but she wasn't actually very good in the game itself. So she couldn't be controlled in the initial version. I believe in the update you can control her now, right? Of course, they remade it, right? She couldn't be controlled. She was basically a pack mule. She carried most of the ammunition, supplies, or whatever that you needed, and occasionally would heal. And her narrative said that to participate in the game, the reason why she was in the game in the first place was that she was supposed to be a native guide for the white character that she was working with, Chris Redfield, right? But largely, the narrative centers around Redfield. It doesn't really talk about her history. You have to be able to read the lore in order to understand that. It doesn't talk about her history. She's a terrible translator, and half the time she's following behind Chris, not leading him as they navigate the various set pieces in the game. If you're a Black gamer looking to be represented as a video game protagonist, you're pretty much out of luck. While multiplayer online battle arenas, MOBAs, and battle royales feature fairly diverse casts of heroes and heroines, their characterization is largely presented as lore. In other words, their backgrounds, their histories, their motivations are largely absent because all you're really there to do is treat them as action figures. You inhabit their bodies with whatever skills they possess, and you take on your opponents who are also being inhabited by other players. From that perspective, you don't necessarily need to know that much about the character, right? In many cases, the characters are also, well, let me take that back because I just changed a little bit. I won't even say that, right? So I will say you can play as ethnic characters in the games, but the game I was thinking of as I wrote this was a game called Apex Legends, right? And they have characters such as Bangalore, Gibraltar, or at least one that's not tied to a minoritized location, Seer, right? All of whom are brown skinned, right? But you will not be able to apprehend how their racial or ethnic identity inform their character. And this is a relatively new trend, but for years, gamers have complained that when minorities are placed into games where you can play multiplayer, in many cases, they were presented as reskinned versions of white characters. So their features wouldn't change, their mannerisms wouldn't change, their voices wouldn't change, but they'd be brown instead of white. I should at this point give a shout out to a developer slash designer who I know as AM Dark. I don't really know her real name, but they are quite notable and have received awards because one of the things they began doing as they tried to interrogate what it meant to be Black in video games was create a library of African oriented hair textures, right? So as a Black gamer, one of the most difficult things you have to deal with when attempting to recreate yourself in digital form is the fact that the hairstyles are terrible. You might get fuzzy cornrows. You might get a bad afro that doesn't move, is completely motionless. It's like you have a black basketball on your head, right? And what AM did was create tools for developers to recreate the kinkiness, the coil, the texture, and importantly, the movement of Black and brown hair in these video games. It's fantastic work. If I was smart, I'd put her link on the website, right? But there are increasing possibilities to be the person of color that you envision yourself as offline in these online spaces. But change can happen. In 2017, one of my favorite developers, Naughty Dog, the creator of the Uncharted video game series, released a game called Lost Legacy, which was actually originally intended to be a downloadable content for their game Uncharted 3. I might get that wrong, right? And it featured a very sexualized femme fatale who had also had bit roles in the previous couple of games named Chloe Fraser. And despite her name, Chloe Fraser is biracial. She's Indian and white, right? And at the time, most people didn't pay attention to how she was voiced because it was just kind of remarkable that someone so brown was featured in a video game featuring the colonialist, imperialist exploits of a treasure hunter destroying multiple indigenous areas in their search for gold and killing people, right? And so Chloe Fraser ended up getting her own freestanding game. As I mentioned, it was originally DLC, but it got so interesting to the developers that they released it as a standalone game. And in that game, she teamed up with another woman of color who was also featured in one of the previous games. And this is a South African character named Nadine Ross. Nadine is a former mercenary, a daughter of a mercenary who runs her own army, which of course was bested by Drake in Uncharted 3 and his quest to find the MacGuffin, right? And she is not biracial, but she is not, say, extremely dark skinned. And I'll show you why I'm saying that in a second. So I have 4 pictures on the screen. If you start from the bottom left, you will see Nadine Ross and all her curly haired brown skin glory. On the top left, you'll see Nadine and the model who was used as the template to create Nadine's face. Let me pause there for a second, at least in terms of introducing pictures. So this use of Black models for Black women is not a new thing. Again, when I wrote about Resident Evil 5, Shiva Alamar, and the game was created by Capcom. We can talk about what it means that a Japanese game creates African descended or American characters, right? Shiva Alamar actually had two models provide their likeness for her representation in the game. The one model was used for her motion capture and her body itself, and another model, the producer said, was used because the first model wasn't attractive enough. And so they used they used another model's facial features to map onto Shiva's head. Problematic? Okay. And so I find it interesting that this tradition of using Black models for Black bodies is continuing. I actually like it, although I understand that bodies don't necessarily have race, but it makes me hopeful that Black people will continue to participate in the game industry, no matter how they get in. But remember, I talked about earlier how sound is a major part of understanding a person's identity. So on the right side of the screen, I also have Nadine Ross in the top right. And then I have, in a not that bright picture, which I probably could have brightened for you, right? Chloe Fraser. And you'll notice their voice actresses look a little different, right? The top voice actress is Laura Bailey. And God damn it, I can't remember the name. I didn't write her name on the slide. And similarly, there's a different voice actress for Chloe Fraser in the bottom. And a huge controversy, particularly around these voice actresses arose when the game Lost Legacy was released, because as you can tell, neither of them match the ethnic or racial identity of the characters they portray on screen. Now, for Chloe, it's fair to say that because she's Indian and biracial, there's not necessarily a real understanding of how she would sound. She has a pretty posh British accent, right? But the idea that many gamers had a problem with the fact that they couldn't find an South Asian woman with a posh British accent, of which apparently UK has thousands, right, to portray this particular character on screen. Similarly, for Nadine, there was controversy because the director of the Uncharted series said, when asked why he chose this particular voice actress for this particular character, he said, well, Laura really nailed the interview. She sounded like the type of person that we want to see. She does a credible, I only know South African accents because I listen to Trevor Noah. So I took what she performed as a credible South African accent, but I still find it troubling that even behind the scenes, whiteness seems to find a way to represent itself in the characterization of Black bodies. One of my favorite people, Lauren up at Northwestern, in a different context, would call this digital blackface. And while I'm not always comfortable with that term, I can see how it is applied here, right? Because these Uncharted games are largely narrative driven, actually Hollywood style third person shooters. So there's a lot more focus on how a character's backstory and motivations inform the type of gameplay they do. Nadine is a brawler. She's really good at hand-to-hand combat and armed combat, while Chloe is a deft hand with a gun, but she's also a getaway driver and a thief, right? And so, say that, I have no idea because it's not in my notes. While it's entirely possible that these white women are particularly apt at playing these particular characters, and there are problematics involved with saying only a Black woman can play a Black woman who's good at fighting, and only a South Asian woman can play a woman who's good at stealing, right? I still wish that they had Naughty Dog had the foresight to still provide voice actresses of color to give them further entry into the profession, right? There are a number who could have done a credible job. The comedic actor Deborah Wilson has a long list of video game voice actor credits, as does Cree Summer, right? Cree Summer's actually, I think, voiced characters in Mass Effect, right? And so there are a number of people they could have tapped, but they chose not to. Right. And it's tempting to say this is racist, but I try to, with hold back from those types of accusations. I will simply say that colorblind casting introduces some problematics in being able to fully connect with the character's representation on screen. And so this game came out in 2017, but I actually was finally able to connect with a video game character in 2005. So you may be familiar with this hunched over man in the image I have on screen. In 2005, Sony Santa Monica introduced the Spartan warrior Kratos as the lead character in their new intellectual property, God of War, right? And maybe some of you are familiar with this character, right? He is distinguished by his deep voice, his brutality, and his anger. They're the hallmarks of his ethnic and gendered identity, right? So in the game, he's Spartan, which technically means that he's Greek, right? There are Orientalist tropes that we could assign to that particular identity, but for the purposes of this presentation, I want you to take a look at his phenotype, right? From the cover of this game, even though he's supposed to be Greek, he could easily be read as a white man. In the lead up to the game, they published a number of articles detailing why his skin is that particular color and why he has that tattoo. And it turns out that Kratos is as white as he is because he suffered a tragedy and then offered his soul to one of the gods of the Greek pantheon. Right. The tragedy was he lost his wife and child. He lost his wife and child to a disease, I believe, if that's correct. Right. And so to grieve for them, he said, you know, Ares, if you take me as your avatar, I will kill everybody you need me to kill. And in the process, the burning ashes, the ashes from their burned bodies were grafted onto his skin, giving him this ghost-like appearance, leading to the sobriquet, his name in the game, the Ghost of Sparta. Kratos is portrayed across the first 6 games, because it's been a lot, right? As a haunted man who has declared vendetta against the entire Greek pantheon for forcing him into this role of the god of war. Did I mention that he kills Ares, I think, in the first game, right? And like many male quote unquote heroes, Kratos 1.0 grieves his dead wife and child, right? Their passing provides additional torment and motivation for his rage-fueled rampage. Spoiler alert, I think it's fair to say that Kratos has daddy issues, right? At some point during the game, in addition to killing the entire Greek pantheon, he kills his father, right? Because it turns out that Kratos is half god and a demigod himself. Right? And I enjoyed these games. I enjoyed the heck out of these games, right? In part because of the violence, in part because of the graphics, but they were just really thrilling games. The combat was super tight. The setting was kind of original. There weren't a lot of games set in Greece or that particular era of legends, right? And so they were really fun to play. They were so popular that in 2018, Kratos was rebooted. Now he has a beard. And Kratos 2.0 has a son with another dead wife to grieve. He has relocated to Viking mythology, land not necessarily named, but he's fighting against the entire Norse pantheon. And events lead him to begin fighting against this new pantheon as he seeks to bury the ashes of his child's mother. I did the best I could to not spoil anything. Now, you may notice that Kratos 1.0 and 2.0 are pale as fuck. And even with their Greek origins, there's no real reason to suspect, right, that their voice actor wouldn't be white as well. So I was hugely surprised to learn that an actor from one of my favorite shows, Living Single, was the voice actor for Kratos 1.0. And another favorite, Christopher Judge from Stargate, was the voice actor for 2.0, right? And both men have really deep, resonant voices, even though most of their voice acting is roars, grunts, screams, yells, and for the 2018 version of Kratos, a lot of repetitions of the word boy. It was immediately clear to me, again, I'm an American and I'm really good at the whole detecting race thing, I think, that these voice actors were Black. And so I began to think, what does it mean that this hyper violent character with daddy issues, right, is one, so popular, But two, does their blackness of the voice actors have anything to do with understanding how violent he is? And in comparison, I could talk about going back to the Uncharted series, both Nolan North, who plays Drake, and Troy Baker, who is another hugely um, visible voice actor, plays Drake's brother Sam, right? Nathan Drake's brother Sam, have been cast in tons of games as the leading voice actor, right? And if you saw them on the street, you probably wouldn't recognize them unless you go to cons, right? So there's no reason why those actors could not have been chosen for this particular voice role, the lead voice of a new IP. But there's something to be said for why this blackness, these black voices were chosen for this, right? And some of it is, I would argue, again, the hypermasculinity of Kratos, because not only is Kratos violent, in the first couple of games, he even has sex scenes. They're not hot copy Grand Theft Auto mod sex scenes. They're basically Kratos goes into a hot tub with a couple of willing women, and the scene fades to black. But he does have sex, right? And then in the second scene, the second in the reboot, Kratos 2.0, he doesn't have sex. He's too busy grieving, right? But he does have a child, so it implies that he's had sex somewhere, right? Um, and so, how do I understand then the first Kratos as technically a criminal, right? He's doing crimes against gods, and the second Kratos as a very distant, I would argue, maybe even deadbeat dad who has returned to raise his child after his wife has passed, right? It's very easy to throw them into stereotypes of Black deviance and pathology. But what I found as I began studying is that stereotypes are complicated. In a book called Communicating Masculinity, Ronald Jackson writes that throughout the literature on Black masculinity, many of which were written by Black feminists, right? There are five sensitizing constructs that reappear through this literature, and they're indicative of Black masculine positionality: struggle, community, achievement, independence, and recognition. Now, Kratos gives not a damn about community, and his achievement is either the satisfaction of his vendetta or the protection of his son. But struggle, independence, and recognition are all arm marks that we can assign to Kratos' journey through these 8 games, right? And offer an additional perspective on understanding how Blackness can then be reinterpreted as not necessarily a default identity, but a state of being, right? Which I think is actually a much more valuable way to understand not just Black masculinity, but masculinity in general. That masculinity is a process, right? Not necessarily a series of traits, right? And so even as the game asks you to dismember, set on fire, or freeze, and I'm thinking specifically of the 2018 and 2023 versions of God of War, dismember or freeze numbers of supernatural entities and gods, right? There's something to be said in these last 2 games, particularly of the journey that Kratos also undergoes as he seeks to first inter the white ashes of his dead wife, and then try to settle his score with the Norse pantheon, where he builds a relationship with his son, right? Um, and the studio, Sony Santa Monica, has done, I would argue, fantastic work in rebooting Kratos, not only as a grizzled older man, but in showing his journey from a man who doesn't really understand how to raise a child he's been left with, to building a growing bonds of intimacy and familiarity, and helping gamers understand his protectiveness towards this particular child, right? He's never not gruff. He's never not difficult with other people. He actually hates helping other people, but he will go to whatever length is necessary in order to protect his child. And that is a depiction of Black masculinity that you rarely get to see on any screen, whether the one in your hand, the one in your living room, or the one that these video game consoles and PCs put up and say, well, what's next? This is a very early stage project. I plan, like I did with my earlier work, to use a method called CTDA, Critical Technocultural Discourse Analysis, which asks researchers to apply a critical cultural framework to digital objects and the discourses that the community using those objects holds about the technology itself. And I can explain that later, right? And I find CTDA to be really helpful because by applying that critical cultural framework, you begin to understand how, and for video games, both the interface, the mechanics, and the industry try to portray characters of color or whoever you prefer to discover, right? I've known folk who use CTA to do queer games, queer characters in games, right? But characters of color, how they're portrayed by the industry and how the people in that, the fans of that particular technology, the users of that particular technology, then reinterpret sometimes or continue to heap stereotypes upon the particular character's representations in the game. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank you guys for listening to me so far. And Dr. Voorhees, if you are ready, we can open up questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. There's a round of virtual applause that you may see at the bottom of your
Cool.
screen. Yeah, thanks for that talk. A lot of interesting ideas to think about regarding representation of race in online spaces. And yeah, I wasn't quite sure that your talk would cleave so close to the topics of masculinity and racialized masculinities. So I was really excited to hear that. Yeah, let's go ahead and open the floor to questions from the audience. And you can feel free to raise your virtual hands, and we'll go ahead and call on you. If you prefer um, to type a question into the chat, then you can go ahead and do that, and I'd be happy to read that for you. And we'll get Dr. Brock's thoughts on that. I do see that there was one question that was put in the chat towards the start of the talk from Ben Burrows. I'm wondering, Ben, if you'd like to turn your mic on and articulate that question, because I'm not quite sure the context that Andre was speaking to when you made that comment and question there.
Oh no. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Ben.
Thank you.
Hey, no, so I guess kind of I was thinking about when I wrote that question, just this calcification of all those, whiteness, masculinity, if that all kind of calcified or intensified around network gaming, and the rise of kind of Bungie leading all the way to Fortnite right now. And I've been just grappling with this question about visibility and anonymity because, as you know, Dr. Brock, my kids are Native Hawaiian, Maori descent, and so they have these really unique gamer tags. And so when they're their middle names because we don't want them to use their names. So when they go on Fortnite or they go on these, network gaming sites and they have these really, that one of their middle names is Tahitoi, people just don't know what to do with that. And so there's a lot of really super racist engagement that they deal with. So I was thinking about that in relation to, the anonymity and visibility and thinking through how that becomes racialized really, really quickly through that process. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Okay, so if I understand your question, Ben, and it's good to hear your voice, I wouldn't say it was calcified with the rise of multiplayer gaming. Game scholars in the 80s were writing about multiplayer user dungeons and MOOs, which I can't remember what the acronym stands for. And in those spaces, a lot of whom were European fantasies where you could be wizards or furry kingdoms where you could be, there was still racial stuff happening in there too. Discrimination against women, one of the most famous canonical articles, A Rape in Cyberspace by Julian DeBell, features multi-user dimension where people just came to hang out and they had wizards and everything in there. And literally a character described how he was going to sexually assault a woman in that particular chat. And so, no, as long as there are people and we are connected to one another, there will always be bad actors. What I would say though, is that these recent console generations, and I've mentioned three, and I'm not sure if I'm thinking clearly. I would argue that multiplayer online gaming didn't really jump off into the PlayStation 2, if that makes sense, and the Xbox, right? Because that was the first time we really had robust enough online connections to where a broad swath of people could play, as opposed to earlier games where it was LAN parties, local area network connections, right? Or college networks where hundreds of people can play at a time, right? And so with the ability for more regular people to come online, more nasty people came online. Not that there weren't nasty people before, right? But something changed, right? And I think the addition of voice chat also added something to that as well. So the one thing I will say about people is that they're going to people everywhere. And if they can find ways to discriminate or be mean to one another, they will find innovative ways to do that. So I'm really happy to hear that you're asking your children to protect themselves from those nasty personalities in online gaming. I would say I'm glad that the hype around VR has died down because I saw a lot of potential for abuse for people. And this is drawing from my understandings and experiences with Second Life, where if you have a racialized avatar that you say represents you, people will treat that avatar badly as if you were coexisting in a physical space with them, but without the physical repercussions like getting punched in the face. So the death of VR hopefully will signal that we don't have to worry about that particular thing happening in, say, LinkedIn spaces or Horizon Worlds, right? But again, I really love Lisa Nakamura's article, Glitch Racism, because she argues that racism is not just something that happens online. Racism is as much a part of online identity, of online experience as online as it is offline. It's not escapable. There's online is not some utopia, right? And so I'm really happy to hear that you're protecting your children. I hope other people are protecting themselves as well, right? But I think you asked a really good question. Is there a way to pinpoint or at least understand how the change in graphical fidelity, broadband connectivity, advanced graphics, and audio capacity have exacerbated or increased the amount of online harassment? Yeah, I think you can make an argument for
Thank you so much, and thank you for making the question better there,
that. Shut up,
articulated
man.
better.
I love you, but shut up. Go give me some in and out.
Thanks so much, Ben. It looks like we have another question from the audience, from Yuri. Yuri, would you like to unmute and ask your question of Dr. Brock?
Yes, I totally can. Do
Yeah.
people hear me well? Okay, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you, Doctor, for this talk. Uncharted and Gods of War are some of my favorite games, so that was really interesting. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on something interesting about the casting of Christopher Judge as Kratos in the last two Gods of War games. In that he was cast after a chemistry test with Sonny Suljic, so the actor for Atreus. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about the idea that Christopher Judge became a black father to a white child, and sort of the meta narrative because the bond between these two extend much beyond just co-workers. There's really a sense of a friendship, of even father-son bond between these two. So I'm really interested in seeing this idea of fatherhood that goes beyond the color of the skin.
It's an interesting question you asked me, and I say that only because a meme popped up on my Twitter. Apparently, there was a bald eagle here in the States who was very lonely, and so it adopted a rock to raise as its child, right? And fortunately, they found an abandoned eaglet, an eagle baby, to give this bald eagle instead. And so the eagle is now raising this baby that's not his own, right? Same species though, right? As if it was his own child. And some comedian put the text of a very popular goofy sweatshirt that said, I'm not the stepdad, I'm the dad who stepped up. Have you seen that t-shirt online? Right. And so I think it's absolutely possible for humans to build affective, emotional, intimate bonds with people who don't look like them. Right. To his credit, in the interviews that I've seen of both Sulik and Christopher Judge, they both seem like really good people. There's a video that I wanted to put part of in this presentation, but again, I failed. Where Judge talks about how he's watched this kid develop as a person and an actor. He said when they first started working together, the kid was 10 and now he's much older, right? And how that growth is not only physical, but emotional and professional, right? He now better understands how to work as an actor. And so I think just the idea that you're working in the same place with people day after day, doing difficult and weird stuff will build bonds, kind of like graduate school. And so I'm not surprised that they built a connection, regardless of their racial or ethnic affiliation.
Oh, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I do remember the video that you talked about, the interview with Christopher Judge. That's what inspired me to ask this question. Thank you very much.
No, you're welcome.
Let's see. Do we have another question from the audience? Yeah, Mark.
Sarah's got a
Great.
question.
Yeah, I have a question
You're gonna
on.
have to bring this
I actually have a question on because you were talking about the stereotyping of for Judge, but he's made to be hyper aggressive character. I was wondering how if the same kind of thing applies to Black female voice actresses, because at the top of my head I'm kind of thinking about Kimberly Brooks, who voices Ashley Williams in Mass Effect. She's like, even if the Mass Effect fandom was like, she's racially ambiguous, but she's voiced by a black woman, but also she's the most aggressive among one of the more aggressive Mass Effect characters, because she's a soldier. So I kind of wonder if it's the same, if it's also there's a kind of thing going on there with Black women.
I actually wouldn't be surprised, especially for Western game studios, there's no way they are somehow above the things that they grew up with. So associating Blackness with certain characteristics, such as Black women are more masculine, more violent, more aggressive, I think that absolutely may have played a part. Although I will say Cree Summer seems to have really escaped those particular allegations, perhaps because her voice is so light, right? But no, I think you bring up a really good point. There's definitely a possible correlation between the race of the voice actor and the race of that particular character.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, those are our friends at the Concordia Tag Lab there that have multiple folks tuning in on Mark's accounts as part of that viewing party. Yeah, so thanks there. It looks like we have another question from Rachel.
I was really excited to hear your ideas about the white media landscape in Japan following the Allied occupation, and the idea that a lot of anime characters and game characters can be read by the Western audience as white. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot as well, because, if you look at the 1980s, you have the fighting game scene with all the different characters. But I've been thinking about, when Street Fighter first came out in 1987, this was also right after Dragon Quest came out in 1986, and Final Fantasy also 1987. And I was also reading Helen Young's book about race in role-playing games, arguing about, how most role-playing games are based on the Tolkien Lord of the Rings ideas, and they're under this undercurrent of racialization in the characters there. And I'm thinking Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy are in this medieval-esque kind of Western fantasy environment, and they all look white, and then the Fire Emblem characters all look white. So they're coming from the manga and anime shonen visual design lineage, but there's also something coming from the fantasy genre, and then your idea of the white media landscape following the occupation, that was just really fascinating to me. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little for us.
I talk about it a little bit in the 2009 article, and I didn't revisit a lot of that work for this particular one, but I was particularly interested because I read about the creator of Astro Boy, and one of the reasons why he created it was because Japan went through a nuclear holocaust, basically, right? And so talking about the effects of surviving a war where nuclear bombs were deployed, and then the ongoing occupation by Western forces. And I think the presence of American service members, military in Japan is ongoing to this day. And there's no reason why that doesn't have any effect. There's no reason I think, to not believe that the West, in particular the West emphasis on whiteness as humanity, would not affect these Japanese animators, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese animators. I do find it interesting that I try to make I try to be as clear as possible in saying Western audiences read them as white, because I don't necessarily agree that the Asian audiences read them as white, and somebody can tell me differently, right? although I am constantly fascinated by blonde characters in anime and video games. Like, what does the blonde represent, as opposed to the blue hair, which I can understand blue being an alternative for black hair, right? Or pink or green or whatever. But blonde seems to carry a particular connotation. In many of the Korean dramas and the Japanese shows that I watch, a blonde character is usually not a good one, right? They can sometimes be a hero, they'll be an anti-hero, but they always have something of the bad boy about them, right? And I wonder how much of that is their understanding of how blondness and whiteness is also representative of not necessarily that good of a person. Right. But it's a fascinating topic. I wish I had devoted more time to it. I think your question is really interesting, particularly the influence of medieval European fantasy on video games, which I think we're hopefully starting to see an end of, thanks to The Witcher and the increase in cyberpunk games. But who knows? We'll probably never see the end of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, for that great question. So there's a couple of other questions. I think there's a hand that just disappeared though, but there's definitely one question in chat at least. And let's go to that question. I will say that we're running close to time with only 5 minutes left, and I'm a little concerned that I'm not going to get to ask my question. But
ask your question first. Go for it.
Yeah, maybe I will sneak that in here. I do hope we can get to Andre's question as well, but I was just curious to hear your thoughts on how much the phrase "boy" shows up in the reboot of the God of War series, and if you think that there is a ironic or possibly racist disjunction with the fact that there's a black actor doing it. I know that personally I could not play more than 45 minutes of Red Dead Redemption campaign because the white character kept saying boy. And growing up in the South, there is a deeply racist connotation to the way that white men say boy. So I'm wondering if you thought about that in the context of Kratos being played by a black voice actor by Christopher Judge. Yeah.
I definitely have a similar upbringing, and so I completely understand where you're coming from. I think the difference for me with God of War is that Christopher Judge is a good enough voice actor so that you can tell his incantation, I'm going to call it an incantation rather than calling his name, of that word. It changes over the course of the game. At first, he's very harsh with it. He sounds very judgmental, but by the end of the game, it's tender. Right? He doesn't say it as loud. He gives it a softer intonation, right? And so even though it repeated so much to the point where the game started being called Dad of War, and every meme you would see would feature some version of the word boy, right? Even though he said it so much, I never felt as if I was being assaulted with it as I have been in other games. I played Mafia 3, for example, where boy is also, it's set in New Orleans in the 60s, and it's also liberally thrown around in ways that are not complimentary or tender. Right. And so I all credit due to the actor, but also to Sony Santa Monica, which gave him that guidance on how to work through this particular character. But that's a great question. I need to add this to this masculinity part.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. And we do still have time for Andre's question, though it may be our last. So from Andre Zanescu, also with the Tag Lab viewing group. Thanks so much for the amazing talk. My question is about the complexity of stereotypes you discussed. Thinking of Kashona Gray's power in the visual, this idea about seeking Black agency is empowering, but can also be subjected to other racist readings. Where do you feel Kratos's portrayal lands between racist hyperviolence and sensitive fatherhood? Is the risk of bad faith engagement worth it? Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Andre.
Fantastic question. So one of the things I talk about in the Resident Evil article is the limited grammar for interaction that's available to you as a gamer, right? In many cases, even though you have 14 inputs on your controller, I counted the D-pad, the analog sticks, the shoulder buttons, the face buttons, right? Many games are not good I'm sorry, many console games are not really good at allowing you sophisticated ways to interact with the world around you. Combat is one of those things that they can do, right? And so even if Kratos was the nicest guy available, many AAA video game titles prefer to do violence, right, as a mode of interacting with the world because it's the most splashy, it's the most flashy. It allows you to both violence and exploration. I'll say those two, right? I played Journey. I played a number of walking simulators, and those games are interesting because of the graphical fidelity. But you literally only use two buttons on the controller, right? As opposed to God of War, especially the most recent one, where I have to memorize moves for the axe, the chains, his climbing, and all sorts of other things, right? Where every button and every input is being used, including the touchpad, right? And so that limited vocabulary does a lot to constrain our understanding of Kratos as a full person, because he is not a full person, at least in the first 6 games. And even I would argue in the 2018 and 2023, because of that limited grammar that's available to you through the controller and through the developer's decision to make um, that particular mode of interaction available. And I want to contrast it with Last of Us Part 1. I can't believe we're calling it Part 1. I guess because there is a Part 2. I don't know if you remember, but in Last of Us Part 1, you can play the guitar. Is that 1 or 2? Might have been 1, right? And although the guitar has no real impact on your combat stats, it doesn't help you get to know Ellie better. It's a contemplative moment where you can take a moment away from the violence that you deal with dealing with these zombies, and the fact that you have a fractious 14-year-old with a smart ass mouth who doesn't know anything about the world and can't control her temper, right? You can take a moment away from that to kind of relax. I would argue the same thing for what was the game? It's a game set in Japan with a samurai, Ghost of something, Ghost of Tsushima, right? Same thing with Ghost of Tsushima. You can collect haiku, right? And other things. So I love that games which are ostensibly only focused on violence can incorporate other either mini games or activities which allow you to see other parts of that character. Not as stupid as say sea shanties and Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed 17, right? But something that allows you to do something more. I would argue in God of War, the exploration elements have been ramped up. God of War, the reboots, have been ramped up to give you time away from how violent Kratos can be. But the reason why I think the first reboot was so well received is that so much of the game is not just exploration, but it's exploration and narrative. You are in a boat with your kid and later a disembodied head, and the head is telling you about the world while you continue to build your intimate relationship with your son. I think those elements of the game where you're not doing the gameplay and you're not doing the combat gameplay, but you're still navigating the world, are the things that help you to understand Kratos' journey, much more so than whether or not he gets an additional dodge roll or invisibility or iframes, right, as he rolls through a particular crushing blow, right? But the capacity to then luxuriate, I would argue, in the ways the developer has allowed you to connect these two characters through the narrative they provided, even to the point where if you stop somewhere in the midst of Mimir telling a story, when you get back in the boat to travel to the next place, Mimir picks up the story. It's like, what was I saying? Right. And it's just simple touches like that, right? To create a sense of continuity, which is really important for establishing trust relationships with somebody and history. I think it helps to de-emphasize Kratos' more violent aspects and get us to see him as a more complex character. That was a long answer, but that was a good ass question too. I need to copy that. Thank you, fellow Andre. That was a great question.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that response, and thank you for the wonderful talk today and this engaging discussion period. Thank you also to thank you also to our campus liaisons organizing watch parties at University of Alberta, at University of Wisconsin, at the Concordia Tag Lab, and also at UBC in British Columbia, and of course to the Games Institute, to Daniel Harley, the co-applicant on this grant that helped make this happen, and to all the members of the Anti-Racism, Decolonization, and EDI committee that also helped make this happen, but especially to you, Dr. Brock. It's been a great talk, and we look forward to hearing more from you, and hopefully having you back again sometime in the near future. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks y'all for hanging out with me for so long.
If you're still around, there is, speaking of all the shout outs to Kashona from the questions, Kashona Gray will be part of a panel next week, also part of the Speakers and Workshop series on just relationships in research practices, just as in justice. So be sure to check that out. There's a flyer in the chat. There's also a survey in the chat. If you're still around, maybe fill that out and let us know what you thought about this and the other events in the series. Thanks, everybody.